right, Mary, you're good to go.
Good evening. I'm Mary Howe. I'm with the Ashtabula County League of Women Voters, and the League of Women Voters in Ashtabula County. And welcome you all here tonight. This is a very important meeting. I hope you do use your care. It's a concern of ours because they're talking about taking the money away from the public education. And since I have a feeling that a lot of you are teachers in public schools, I think you really are here to learn something, I think, and see where we can go from here. On the flyer that you were given when you came in, there is some information about the League of Women Voters. If you're interested, go to our website. If you're interested, want to join, we'd love to have you join. So welcome. We'll let Dr. Galito do the introduction.
All right, it was on. I wasn't able to hear. I want to make sure we could all hear everybody. If at any point, like the teacher voice, y'all know that teacher voice. If you can't hear in the back, Lewis, you're there. Lewis, where, over there. If you can't hear us, if you have a question, we are asking that you hold the questions until a very robust Q&A session. There is on one of the handouts, a place where you can put some notes if you need Post-its. If you need anything, let me know. But by show of hands, how many teachers do we have? Former teachers count? Former teachers? How many administrators? All right, administrators. How many parents? All right, a few parents. How many, what else am I missing? League members. All right, they're dispersed throughout the room, so if you have any questions about the league, you have people throughout the room. What am I missing? Board members, absolutely, very, very important. Critical. School board members. Wonderful. And by the end, I'm going to look at our sign-ins, so I'll be able to tell you how many districts we have represented as well. So there's a number of school districts that are here this evening. So I know that Dr. John Patterson probably doesn't need a lengthy introduction from me, but I'm going to do it anyway, because his credentials are pretty astounding. So Dr. Patterson is here tonight. He's devoted his career to public service, education, and community advocacy, leaving an impact both in the classroom and the Ohio State Legislature. He's a lifelong resident of Ashtabula County, and he earned his PhD, not EDD, PhD in education from Penn State University, which just happens to be a great university, where he specialized in active learning and political advocacy. Over more than 3 decades as an educator at Jefferson area local schools. Any representation there? Hey, cheers, Jefferson local. Woo! All right, now let's make lights. Okay, he mentored countless students, taught U.S. history and world affairs, and advised to award-winning Model United Nations teams. Model UN. How many of you have done Model Legislature? I did that too. Oh yeah. See, and we're still in this space in many, many years. In 2013, Dr. Patterson transitioned from the classroom to public service, becoming state representative for Ohio's 99th district, serving 4 terms. During his tenure, he co-sponsored and played a pivotal role in developing the Patterson Fair School Funding Plan, the most significant reform of Ohio's public school funding system in decades. Designed in collaboration with Representative Bob Cupp and a team of educators, financial experts, the plan was built on equity, transparency, sustainability, ensuring every child in Ohio, regardless of their zip code, receives a fair and adequate education. Beyond school funding, Dr. Patterson championed this legislation, still championing this legislation, to improve public education, water quality, local infrastructure, and agricultural policy. His work directly contributed to securing funding for vital projects across the county and rural Ohio. From 2022 until, it's been a really long month, hasn't it? Until last month.
January 20th.
Yes. He served as the Ohio State Executive Director for the USDA Farm Service Agency, where he continued his mission of strengthening Ohio's rural communities. His contributions have been recognized with numerous awards, including Legislature of the Year, Ohio Farm Bureau's Friend of Agriculture honors. Married for over 40 years, Dr. Patterson is proud father of 2 and is deeply involved in Ashtabula's local organizations. And again, most of us at some point here in this county, you've had some contact with Dr. Patterson over the years. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to him for a great evening here.
You think I'm on?
Are you on?
I'm on. Am I on? Can you hear? All right. Thank you, Jessica.
Yes.
Appreciate it, Dr. Levito. And I have with me tonight a very special guest and dear friend, Mr. Kevin Lilly, recently retired. Yes, let's go. Recently retired from, I think it's, Geneva. Yeah, no, I'm teasing. My wife taught at Geneva delighted to be here. And I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be at this point than with you tonight. So I have a question for you. How many of you were homeschooled? How many of you went to private school or parochial school? Okay, you can exercise your hand. Keep them up, keep them up. How many of you went to public school? How many of you were never educated? You see my point? Education lies at the foundation of everything we do. It's critically important. Now, I want to take you back in time, 1785. It's like history class again. I like this. Land Ordinance of 1785. You do realize Ohio was one of the first states carved out of what was called the Northwest Territory, north and west of the Ohio River. It was the first one surveyed. In fact, if you were to go to East Liverpool, there's a pin outside the city there where the surveying began at the borders of what would become Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And in that land ordinance of 1785, we measured, we actually surveyed townships, 6 miles by 6 miles. And if you multiply, here's a math question for you, 6 times 6, how many square miles in the township? 36, very good, excellent math. And if you divided those up, there would be 36 different sections, that's important to the story, 640 acres each. But section 16 was critically important. Anybody know why? School. It was set aside. The money generated from section 16 was to be set aside for school. Thomas Jefferson and other founders thought it was important for the sustenance of democracy. You cannot have a fully functioning democracy with illiterate, ill-informed citizens. Public schools. Fast forward 1851. Now I'm going to give you a homework assignment right now. You have your cell phones. You can get them out. And Jessica, what's the, how do they get on the internet from here?
It's the guest account, KSU guest, and it should be open access for you.
Yes, you guessed. And I'll give you a moment. Tell me, raise your hands when you're on the internet, because I'm going to give you a site to look up. Thanks, Abe. You're good.
You should have candy and make it a race. Come on.
Yeah, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, 4, 5. All right. So Google in Ohio Constitution, Article 6, Section 2. Article 6, Section 2. Everybody, have you found it? And Cam, do you have that?
Yes.
Would you be so kind to read that for us all?
Article 6, Section 2, the Ohio Constitution addresses the funding of common schools. It states that the General Assembly will ensure an efficient system of schools using taxation and income from school trust fund. It also prohibits any religious sect from having exclusive control over of school funds.
Oh, my. Have you ever heard of thorough and efficient? That our common schools, as they were called, should be thorough and efficient. That's critically important. We need to make sure the schools are funded so that things function accordingly. All right. How many of you have heard of Nathan DeRolf or the DeRolf decisions? Just a few of you, so I'm going to take you back memory lane. Nathan DeRolf was a high school freshman, northern local in Perry County. It's just west of Columbus. He and his classmates were forced, because they were crowded, and this would be in the late 80s, to take their exams standing up at a desk because they didn't have enough room in the classroom. There was also a building in southeast Ohio in a little town called Flushing, an elementary school. No running water. Kids actually had to leave the building to go out. And the joke was, there's no flushing in Flushing. All right? we had failed to provide adequate facilities for our children. And so came the first of the there are four court cases called DeRault versus the state of Ohio. There were several rulings that the Supreme Court handed down that are important. First, that we had underfunded our public schools. Now that we have corrected. Think of the new schools or alterations in Conneaut. Ashtabula City, minus the roof. Oh my gosh, brand new school, breaks my heart. Little place called Jefferson, Geneva, Grand Valley. That all meets with the DeRault decision. Trying to update. But there are other things. You have heard of the part of the DeRault decision that says that it is not constitutional in terms of one of the key words. Starts with letter A. Adequacy and equity. And this is what you have heard, the over-reliance on property taxes, correct? So let's start on this because it's the DeRault decision that is going to take us down the winding road to school funding. Let's talk about adequacy first. Anybody want to take a guess as to how we determine what is adequate for public education? That's exactly what the Supreme Court came up with too, by the way, not that they hadn't figured it out. All right? We're going to take care of adequacy. Equity. Equity is not equality. Equity is not equality. Now, Kevin, you play tennis, do you not?
That's correct.
And you play tennis well, don't you?
I try.
I don't. Now, let's look at us. Kevin and I are about the same height, right? He's a lot more handsome, no doubt. You left-handed? You're right-handed, so am I. Now, looking at us, you would say we are equal, wouldn't you? But we're not equitable because his tennis game is far superior than mine. So if we were going to make a match equitable between us, I would tie both hands behind his back, right, Coach Murphy? Force him to play in one side or the other, and then I would get a double bounce rule. That would be equity, allowing me to compete in the same playing field. I'm going to get to that. Now, the over-reliance on property taxes, you've heard that. There are two ways that schools collect local money. One is on your property tax. And Kevin Lilly, because you're from Geneva, what's the other?
A school district income tax.
Voted on by,
The voters of the school district.
and you can do a blend of that. Fair enough?
Of course, property tax for the longest time was the only method until I believe 1981, and then that was rescinded in 83. Went back into effect in 89, and then further changed in 2005 when they allowed a school district income tax on the earned income tax base only.
Exactly. All right, so we have 4 DeRault decisions: equity, adequacy, over-reliance on property taxes, core values, public education. Right now, at the end, I'm going to put on my preacher hat. I'm going to tell you why this education is so important and why you must take action. Are you with me? Next slide, please. So these were the folks who originally came together, and I want to point something out. There's my good friend, Speaker Cupp in the 4th District, a Republican. There's another good friend of mine, Representative Gary Scheer from just south of Columbus, Circleville. They grow pumpkins there. Good Republican. You can see Senator Vern Sykes then from Akron. His daughter, Amelia, is a congresswoman now, served with her. My dear friend, Senator Later, she is now a mayor in southwest Ohio near Dayton, a good supporter of public education and a Democrat. And then, because everybody except for Speaker Cupp, the 4 of us were all gone from the House, and Peggy was leaving the Senate, Bride Sweeney, a Democrat, and Jamie Callender, a Republican from Lake County, both were on finance, and they spearheaded the initial effort once we were out of the House. Now, why do I tell you this? It's a magical word. When you have good legislation, it starts with the letter B, Mary. B-I. Bipartisan, exactly. I didn't answer the right question, I'm sorry. Bipartisan. We all have blind spots, but when we work together for the good of all, great things can happen. Bipartisan, right from the get-go. Next slide, please. So when we started, and we're going to get into guarantees, don't worry about what that means right now. But out of the 610, now I think there's only 609 districts, 503 were either on the cap, we'll get into caps, or the guarantees, but they weren't on a formula, which means there was no predictability in terms of the money they would receive from the state. Now let me ask a special guest here. Hey, Abe.
Yes, sir.
You've been married quite a while, right?
Yes, sir.
How many years?
16.
How many happy years?
17.
Softball game. Now, Gabe, you have a family budget, don't you?
Yes, sir.
And you know about how much money is coming in, yes?
Yes, sir.
So what if I told you, sorry, I'm out of the camera.
You're making it hard.
So what, I'm making it hard for you, but I'm back in the classroom
I'm
now.
trying to follow you around, it's
Sorry.
hard.
So Gabe, what if I told you that you have to do a budget for the next 5 years without knowing what you're going to be making in years 3, 4, and 5? Would you feel comfortable with that?
Absolutely not.
No way. That's what we do to our schools. Schools are forced to have a 5-year forecast, but the state has only a 2-year budget. Now, if you ask some of the folks in the school board here, or the principals, or the superintendents, it causes nightmares constantly, doesn't it? Because we don't have, or we didn't have, a formula that was predictable. Next slide, please. So here were our critical values. We needed to know what it took for each child to succeed and what that cost might be. We wanted to make sure that every kid got a fair shot, and that's the equity piece. That a kid in southeast Ohio had the same opportunity as one in the inner city of Columbus. That districts would be funded fairly and not with a deck stacked against them. And that the funding would follow the student, wherever the student was educated. Does that make sense? You're all on the same page? Looks good so far, yes? Next slide, please. So, you need to know something about the Ohio House, how it works, how it doesn't. 2-year budget. Typically, the Finance Committee is the one who handles all budgetary matters. Now, they changed it this year, and I'll get into that later. But there's a subcommittee on finance called the Education, Primary, Secondary Subcommittee on Education Finance. There are 5 members on that committee who deal with funding once every 2 years for about 5-6 weeks. How complicated do you think school funding is? Incredibly, right, Mary? Incredibly complicated. And to have folks that only dabble with it come up with something crazy. So Bob Cupp and I, Speaker Cupp and I, wanted to go to the people who knew, who do this every day. And so we recruited, you can see Michael Barnes. Oh, who's that second guy down there? What's his name? He's a has-been from Ashtabula County. Jerry Brockway. You might have heard of him. Recruited him. And then some of the others, Jared Bunnings from down south. Oh, here's a nice guy, Mike Hamlin from Chardon. Wonder how he was chosen. Wonder who knew him. Tom Osler from out in Harrisburg, definitely. And, oh, my goodness gracious, look here. A rock star. Now, you don't suppose I recruited people I knew who knew, did you? Of course I did. Of course I did. Now, notice something. They're from all over the state. They're from wealthy districts. They're from not so wealthy districts. But their mission was to come up with a pure approach that was not going to favor one district over another. Now, can you imagine the temptation of fixing a formula that favored your particular school district? It would be there, not these guys. Next slide, please. So here are the other work group members. We had treasurers and superintendents from all over the state help us because they were the experts. They knew. And Bob and I were humble enough to know that we didn't know. So this group began its work in the fall of 2017. And they took their work seriously. And this work group is still together. Now, some have retired, but it's sort of like the Hotel California. They're not leaving us. They're still there. Next slide, please. All right. So you know John Kasich. This cartoon was famous. Somehow we arrived at $6,000 a student. It was called residual funding. So whenever money was left after funding everything else, we divided that by the amount of students we had in Ohio, and that's what each school district would get. And in my time there, it was raised between my first term and second term, it went to $6,010 and then $6,020. Now this is after the DeRolf. The first DeRolf decision was in '97. We went through a series of formulas. None of them stuck until we got to Kasich's so-called bridge formula, the bridge to nowhere, and we were stuck. And it all came to a head in the spring of 2017. Now I want to share you a true story. So at the time, Speaker Tuck was Chairman of Primary Secondary Education Committee. I was on that committee, and we were working together. This is before the work group was created. And Governor Kasich would have his State of the State in various places in Ohio. This particular year, we were in Sandusky at the ballroom. And Bob and I found ourselves in the men's room. This is a little humor, you'll appreciate this. And we were standing there washing our hands, and Bob said to me, "John, I've got the runs." And I said, "That's great." Now, what am I talking about when I say the runs? My dear coming out superintendent, what are the runs also called? You don't use this term? No. Hey, we might want to X that out. It's a simulations. They're sometimes simply called, I thought, did you use the term runs? Okay, let me retract that bad joke there. In the legislature, we would refer to the simulations for all districts, Lori. So you know, if you ever hear this term, it's not what you think. We would refer to them as the runs. Not simulations, the runs. Okay, my bad. Well, the guy standing behind me incredulously gives me this goofy look, like, what are you talking about, Bob? You got the runs and you're happy about it? Yes. Well, he just happened to be the president of the Sandusky County Visitors Group. Now, if you've ever seen the spreadsheets, they're massive. And he offered us the opportunity to use his office so we could spread all these out and look over the entire projections, the entire simulations, district by district. And it was almost simultaneous after this happened. There was a district in southern Ohio along the river, Manchester Local. 2 power plants, 2. coal-fired power plants going offline. And Kevin, would we have collected tax dollars from those power plants?
Yes,
How many mill levy do you think Manchester Local was looking at to replace the monies lost from the power plant? What's the highest mill, Lori, what's the highest levy you ever asked for? Hey, Claudia. 5? Ashtabula City, highest, maybe 5, 6. Kevin, what's the highest in Geneva?
we hadn't voted for property tax since I've been there.
Okay, you're very responsible with your money. Any guesses what Manchester Local? Jefferson, you never broke 6. Any guesses what Manchester Local was looking at? 9. Keep going.
10.
Keep going.
21.
Higher. 90?
50.
50. Oh, higher.
90?
Keep going.
100?
Keep going. 120 mils. Just keep the lights on. They were that reliant on property taxes. And Bob and I looked at each other and said, we can't let this happen. Now, we fudged the formula because there was, remember K6 contusions there? We drove money into that district by monkeying around with the formula. But we were determined not to let it happen. And that's when we made a commitment to one another to get this on board for the state of Ohio. Fair enough? Next slide, please. So, fair school funding plan. There are 3 essential ingredients here. Remember I mentioned adequacy? Base cost is it. And then we'll get to the state local share, that's capacity, that's equity, and then categorical aid. Okay? Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the base cost. Next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure that all aspects of a student's life in the school was covered, from the time they got on the bus in the morning to the time they returned home in the afternoon. The whole banana, everything. So we knew that there were some models that didn't work. We knew that some kids needed extra help. We knew that schools were not evenly funded throughout the state. We're going to fix that. Next slide, please. So now you have a handout. Let's look at this handout. Because everything was built on research and best practice. Look at the first line. Kindergarten. FTE means full-time equivalent. So, and this is a real school district in Southeast Ohio. This is Trimble Local at the time. 20 students equals 1 teacher. And if you look at 2nd grade, 3rd grade, goes to 23 to 1. Junior high, 25 to 1. And high school, 27 to 1. Make sense? All right. Now let me ask an expert a question. Hey, Gus. You're active in education, yes? Some degree, Ashtabula County ESC board member. Gus, I have a question for you. You're a superintendent in, let's say, Jefferson. And I'm a superintendent in Pymatuning Valley. Make sense? You with me so far?
Yes.
And Gus, we have the same number of students. But our funding from the state isn't going to be equal. Why?
Evaluations.
Oh, just look at your research here. See this? Number of students. How could Gus's and mine, if we had the same number of students, not be the same? Oh, no, we're still with base costs. So Gus, you're a young guy, right? About 29 or so? Work with me on this. 40 years ago, okay. So if Gus had a lot of students at the high school age in that 27-to-1 ratio, and my district, we had a bunch of kids in kindergarten and third grade, and we had the same number, who needs more money? My district. Make sense now, Gus?
Yep.
That's how accurate this formula is. It's attuned to the special circumstances of each district in Ohio based on each district's own student population. And that's just out of the box. So let's go further in this discussion we're having. Oh my goodness! Look down under base A teacher. We know that we need specialists. Art, music, and gym. No, you don't say. How important is music for students' well-being?
The most important.
Amen. Can you sing that to us from the heavens? The most important. Right. Ashtabula County. Choral Music Society. Children's choir. Got it. Music, art. Hey, Lou Murphy, how important is gym? It's very important. Thank you. And what was happening during the basic administration when we had, remember, $6,000 a student? Where are my school board members here? When you weren't getting money from the state, you were going to have to cut some things. And probably what you cut were those things that weren't tested, like art, music, and gym. Tell me that's fair for a kid. That's what got me riled up. Now I know every student that's ever seen in high school, right, Allison, came solely for my history class. The only reason they were there, not for tennis, not for money, well, they were there for this. And it was tested. But there were some kids, I suspect, who came for other things, like maybe band, chorus, sports, auto-UN. You know what happened to attendance when we started cutting those things out? It dropped. People wondered why kids hated school. How many of you love math class? Hey, there's a few. How many of you hated history? Be careful now. My point is we all have different interests. And when you start cutting out the things that kids are interested in, of course they're not going to show up. Of course there's going to be behavioral problems. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to be functioning. And it all flows from the dollar. Are you with me? We have to come up with a plan that is adequate. So let's go on to art, music, and gym. Oh, you're going to need substitute teachers. You're going to need professional development. It's all there in the base cost. Now let's move on. Oh, co-curriculars. That means we could pay for an athletic director. Can't have sports, got to have an athletic director. We never thought about that before. Keep on going. School guidance, safety and security, non-personnel. Now what do you think safety and security, non-personnel for a student is? Security cameras, locks, it's all figured in. It's all figured in. Library. Oh my gosh, you mean a library is important for our kids? Yes, and we funded librarians, social emotional security, life support, all that. Technology. Total student support instruction. Oh, you see that social emotional security? What do you suppose this security is about? That is funded.
Mental health.
That's true too. School resource officers. Keep in mind, I represented Chardon. I worked with Frank Hall. We wanted to fund school resource officers, but there was no provision in the Ohio Revised Code. There was no definition of school resource officers. So before we could fund it, we had to describe it. Representative Lazaret and I got that bill passed so that we could be folded into the fair school funding program. So when somebody tells you they want to arm teachers because they can't pay for a school resource officer, that is a blatantly false statement. It's in the base cost. I don't know about you, think of some of your teachers. Let's hire the professionals, you know what I mean? It's there. Let's go on. And this is all the base cost. Oh my goodness, down to the green part. You're going to need building leadership, that means the principal. You're going to need operations. Oh my goodness, you're going to need building costs, square foot per building, you're going to need all that. Let's go down to the purple part. Lori Riley, what are we going to need in the school?
Treasurer.
Thank you. Kevin Lilly, what are we going to need in the school?
Superintendent.
Very good. It's all here. District leadership. Oh my goodness, we actually have an EMIS. It's right here. We've got an EMIS specialist here. It's all there. Total leadership. Everything is there for a typical kid in a typical school. Adequacy. Makes sense. All right. Now, if we know what it costs, let's go on to the next step. How are we going to pay for it? Next slide, please. State and local share. Next slide. Oh my. And this is where Kevin's going to help me. Kevin, in the state constitution of 1851, who bears the responsibility for educating our students in Ohio?
Good question. Local district,
Local district is one. Who has the other half?
the state.
So it's a partnership. Don't let anybody tell you that it falls all on the state or all on the district. It is a partnership. Like that happy marriage of how many years again, Abe?
16.
It's a partnership. Very good. That's pretty cool. But how do we determine it? There are wealthy districts, there are poor districts. How do we make it? What's that magical word? Starts with the E. Equitable. Go ahead, Kevin.
So there's a local capacity component to determine what each district is capable of raising towards this funding model. It's comprised of 60% property tax, where in the past, it was all property tax valuation. And 40% based on income in that district. And that's broken down to 20% based on the federal adjusted gross income and 20% based on the federal median income. And that was derived because federal adjusted gross income can be a little volatile, where the median income is a little more steady, so they balance those out. So that's the local part, that once that base cost is determined for a district. And I think another thing to point out, in your earlier example of 2 power plants down in
Manchester.
Southern Ohio, the closing of those power plants didn't only affect that district in that prior funding formula, but affected every district in the state, because the state looked at the total amount and what portion each district got of that. So something that happened in one area of the state could affect everybody's funding. Now with this fair school funding plan, each district stands on their own based on their needs according to that base cost funding model, determine what the cost is, determine their local capacity to raise, and then how much money should come from the state.
So Kevin, let me ask you some questions then. This 60% that's based on property values. If property values were to go up in, let's say, Ashtabula County, would that impact the funding formula?
Yes, it would.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. And now let's go back to income. How do we determine adjusted gross and such? Are those figures, not personally, but collectively, are they available?
Yes.
So if a district comes, if the property valuation is low, and the district's, one personal district's residential income is rather low, will they get more help from the state? You don't say. So 2 districts side by side, even if they have the same student population, might get more or less help depending upon their, what's that magic C word? C word. Capacity to raise their own share. It's that tailor-made. The base cost is focused right on that particular district. and their local capacity is different to them. That's equitable, isn't it? That's what this is all about. Anything to add before we get into the next steps, Kevin? You think of anything on this part? Capacity? All right. Oh, there's something else that I forgot. Oh my goodness. We've got to transport kids to school, right? Let's see. Phil, are there any English any kids who don't speak English? Is their #1 language in Geneva? Oh my goodness, we have that problem. We have special needs kids too. Oh my gosh, and we've got kids who have economically disadvantaged homes, and then we have ESC. Oh my gosh, there's got to be more to this formula. Next slide, please. This is what's called categorical aid, or add-ons. You get the base cost. Remember I said typical kid, typical town, no other base cost. Now we've got to add to the recipe. In addition to flour and water, we've got to throw in some hot peppers. Here it comes. Next slide, please. So here are some things that are part of categorical aid that are added on. Now let's look at the first one, poverty. You think kids who live in poverty need more help? They do. And we asked for, and the results are getting ready to come in on how much it costs to educate economically disadvantaged kids. And it's going to be more. It's got to be more. To be equitable. Then there's preschool that we wanted. Kids who come to school with some ability, oh imagine, knowing their colors, knowing their numbers, and maybe a few words will do better in school, wouldn't they? And then special education. We can't leave those kids behind because they're still creatures of God. They deserve an education. And then on the other hand, you've got these gifted kids. I was never one. But they deserve to be challenged, yes. And then, of course, transportation, ESC. Oh my goodness. Hey, Gus. Kevin, can I borrow your mic again? I want to interview an expert here. How many of you know what the ESC does? What's it stand for?
Educational
Service Center. Gus, tell us some of the things you provide for our districts. Gus is on the board. Go ahead.
We provide practically anything they ask for.
You don't say that.
And, for example, education, we provide that.
Oh, sorry.
You talking if they can't hear you in the back is all. Sorry. Just up and lights on.
I wonder if this is. It is on. Just hold it closer. Gus.
All right.
There you go.
We provide any kind of support they need. For example, they need some special services for students. They only have, say, 2-3 students. We hire a teacher, or we share with another school district, so make it affordable for them to service a child.
Sure.
That's one.
Yeah.
We have support also from the teachers. We provide, if they ask for, we provide training, whenever training is necessary, and a variety of things. We also manage quite a few of the money that they get from the state or the federal government for them. And so these kinds of services. And then
Fantastic.
if you need any, let us know.
Did you hear that, Lori? My point is, ESC funding is critically important, and it often is overlooked because they do their job so well, we don't hear about it. Then this CTE, that's Career Tech. STEM schools. Intel's coming to Ohio. Anybody seen the facility in Lincoln County? Looks like a big airport. They have their own concrete plant there. Power lines running everywhere. STEM, STEAM. In this century, kids need that kind of education. That's an add-on. And then finally, and I'm going to let Kevin get into this, vouchers and open enrollment. We also have to do that for those kids, according to state law. All right, next, so everybody good with categoricals? Base cost, local capacity, and then add-ons. Good with that? All right, next slide, please. So here's what happened. Since the first iteration of the Fair School Funding Plan, and it did get into the budget in June of 21, we've added 1.5 billion in state funding. That's a pretty good increase. It's a start. And this is a 6-year phase in. Years 1, 2, 3, and 4 are phased in. 5 and 6 are on the table right now. That's where you come in. And the base cost, look, for the Kasich years is $6,020, $8,240 base cost in 25. Now, you might say, well, that is important. Check out the price of eggs lately. Just saying. Now, I was on the TV show not too long ago out of Kaya in the morning, Sunrise Live, and somebody was wondering why the cost of eggs were so high. And they said this early on, it had something to do with bird flu and creating shortages and such. But you know, inflation is real. Inflation also affects school districts, the cost of education. So it just serves with notice, and that's important. We have to adjust what we call inputs, the money that we fund on the base cost, to match inflation. That makes sense, doesn't it? Keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So if you look at this one, this was in the early Kasich years, and these are the years of the Fair School Funding Plan. Now, that may not mean much to you, but to Kevin, I think it does. Kevin, do you want to offer some insight into what they're seeing?
Well, if you've seen the chart that shows the different pools, yeah, the state general revenue fund in the blue, which is obviously the biggest portion of the funding provided. The Ohio lottery, which while it was supposed to be extra funding when it was instituted, it really just was kind of worked into the formula and displaced other funds that were used elsewhere. You see TPP per kilowatt hour reimbursement, which you can see how it changed from more in the early years to very little. That was something that was phased out for many districts by Governor Kasich as a form of, first it was a local funding, then it was a reimbursement, and that reimbursement was phased out. And then property tax relief through rollback and homestead, the gray part, which is just money that's rolled back, benefiting an individual taxpayer, dollars off your tax bill, reimbursed by the state.
And then Governor DeWine did add student wellness dollars.
This is successful.
Next slide, please. So, this is a summary of what we've been talking about. Base cost, adequacy, capacity, equity, and the categoricals on top of that. One of the judges, and by the way, Bob Cupp was a Supreme Court justice at one time. One of the justices, Paul Pfeiffer, who concurred in the wrong decision, told my dear friend Bob Cupp that we have met the constitutional mandate. If what? It's fully funded. If it's fully funded, that's where you come in. Your assignment's coming. Jody, your assignment is coming. Next slide, please. So, you've heard a lot of talk about guarantees. Probably read about them, and Governor Kasich is wanting to scale these back from 100% to 95 and to 90. That's his original budgetary input, if you will. Kevin, talk to us about guarantees. What do they mean? What do they do?
Well, guarantees just make a district that may lose money as a result of a change in the funding formula guaranteed to receive the same amount of funding that they did the year before. And like Dr. Patterson said, before the fair school funding plan, when we had a formula that wasn't based on anything, just a number drawn out of a hat, 382 school districts were on a guarantee, not receiving anything based on the funding formula, just guaranteed to receive no more. So it didn't matter what their ADM change was, up or down, they were stuck on a guarantee.
Oh, what's ADM?
The average daily membership, basically the number of students that are educated now in that district. So the guarantees just keep it until this is fully funded, which is kind of important. I don't know how the governor can even think of doing away or lowering the guarantee until the plan is fully funded, which it isn't. As Dr. Patterson said, it was phased in 1/6. 1/6 the first year, 2/6. This is something that is done in almost any funding formula change. It's always been phased in so that you determine what is needed in 2021, but you're not going to get it until 2027. And it works that way because it costs more. The state legislature doesn't want to see a huge increase in the cost of funding that model. So they phase it in. So we've been phased in for 4 years. This is the current year, 24-25, the 4th year of phase-in that was instituted in the second biennium of the fair school funding plan. And now we're looking at trying to get the 5th and 6th years phased in so that by that 6th year, it would be fully funded.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the first one. No district receives less. Remember, we're going to fund where the students are educated. What do you know about student enrollment in Ohio? It's declining. We are not having as many kids. So some of you have got to get to work on this. Now, I keep telling my wife that I'm not getting anywhere. At any rate, if enrollment is declining, and I think this is where the governor was going, if enrollment is declining, then those schools, to be fair, ought to receive less money, potentially. But in this transitory state, we wanted to ensure that they didn't get the rug pulled out from under them. So it's a temporary guarantee. Likewise, this transportation guarantee, Kevin worked like a dog on a transportation formula. Kevin, does it cost more to run a bus in Southeast Ohio, hills and such? Hey, you're from Marietta. Does it cost more down there? Why?
Well, it can cost more even in a metropolitan area like Columbus because of the distance that they may be traveling from where to pick up the kid to the school that they're going to. So whether it's in a metropolitan area or in a rural area, there are many variations that can cause different costs or higher costs.
And we are by law required public schools to transport all students, correct?
That's correct.
And what does all students mean?
That would include your traditional public school student, your parochial school students, your charter school students, pretty much everything but a private school.
So there's a study regarding transportation that's supposed to be implemented in the next budget. And then the supplemental targeted assistance, no matter how perfectly try to make this formula, there were glitches. I'll be the first to tell you, there's no perfect formula. I'll give you an example. Ever been to Kelly's Island? Beautiful place. There are kids who live there. Or you know this answer. Do you know what it costs to educate those kids? It's a boatload of money. It's like $20,000 a student. They're flown into the mainland. Okay, but they still have an education. So there's outliers like that. There's crazy things that happen. Plants close. You've got to be able to protect those schools from those unforeseen vagrants. So that's why the supplemental targeted assistance. Go ahead, next slide. All right, now you're going to hear that schools are flush with cash. Remember, there was one-time federal money. And remember, 5-year forecast, 2-year budget? If you're a school superintendent or a treasurer, are you going to spend it all? Kevin, what would be a good carryover for a district to have?
I'd say at least between 25% and 33% of your average monthly expenditures.
Anybody predict any more federal funding coming to schools? They would be irresponsible if they didn't have, historically, a little bit more in the bank account. So don't buy into this argument. It's just a weird sort of anomaly that has occurred. Kevin, anything you want to add to that?
Well, in addition to the federal funds, those federal funds are received. Some districts spend it differently than others, but many districts spend it on things that they could sustain. You didn't want to bring in new things because once that federal funding was gone, you wouldn't be able to sustain it. So in some districts, if they have restored cuts, they plan on restoring with their general fund. So their general fund balance grew while they used the federal funds, and that caused some artificially high cash balances.
And you just said something that I neglected to mention. This term mandate, you ever hear of it? Mandate, now, it doesn't mean that Kevin and I are going out to the winery after this. You got it, good. We're slow there, but you got it. In the Fair School Funding Plan, no school is mandated to spend money the way the state wants to. You are free to allocate, you're getting the funds, this is what we're giving you money for, school resource officer, librarians, etc. But you and the local school board determines how that money is spent. That's what I call local control. You like local control? Let the boards decide. It is not mandated. It is not prescriptive. That's another beauty of this plan. We did not want to tie the hands of the local school districts.
And that's for the biggest costs.
Exactly. Thank you. Next slide, please. So now we need to get into the 20 mil floor. Go ahead, my friend. This is a favorite subject.
Well, first, is everybody familiar with the term House Bill 920 and reduction factors? On review. If you see your tax bill, when you receive it, after your taxes are shown, there are some subtraction, reduction factors. Back in 1976, the legislature put into effect House Bill 920 to kind of control inflation. So basically, it was mandated by Ohio law and designed to keep tax revenue stable when property values increase or decrease. The reduction factor will keep the revenue to schools, cities, libraries, etc., at nearly the same level as originally approved by the voters. So levy goes on in 1978-9, let's say, and it's going to raise $1 million while they're going to try to keep it at that level, $1 million. So they have to reduce the effective millage of that. Let's say it was 5 mils, they have to reduce that 5 mils down so it continues to raise the $1 million. And this would be applied against each individual levy in that district based on when it was passed, what it was meant to raise, and then total to the district. Now, when a valuation increases, the only inflationary increase that a district receives is on its inside mills. And inside mills vary from district to district. In each taxing district in the state, there are 10 inside mills that are unvoted. They're divided between your county, your city, your schools, your cemetery district, or JBS, different entities, and a total of 10 mils. Anything above 10 mils has to be voted. So as property valuations increase due to a reappraisal or triennial updates, they are factored back via these reduction factors to raise the same money that they were when they voted, so you have a lower effective millage.
So are you telling me that even with inflation, districts can't raise more money on their own unless they put a new levy on the ballot?
That is correct. That's
No.
why you see districts constantly going to the ballot, especially when they're relying just on property taxes. Now, the legislature also put into place the 20 mil floor that Dr. Patterson just mentioned. So it's a minimum tax rate. No district can go below the 20 mil floor. That 20 mil floor is comprised of whatever their inside mills are and their voted mills. So what happens and what happened in this recently completed triennial update, how many people know what happened in the housing market as far as a lot of bidding out there? People put their house up for sale and all of a sudden they were getting 50 to 60,000 more than the asking price, benefiting from coming out of COVID, high construction costs, so it was going to cost a lot more to build a new home. And so they were looking at existing homes, but they were willing to pay more because it was still going to be less than what it would cost to build a new home. So that drove up home values, and in that trend update, drove up valuations. And in Ashtabula County, the average was 32% increase. And that was based on 2% over 3 years, 2% of sales, because that's all Ashtabula County had to look at. In a larger area like Highland County or Lake County, they would have a lot more sales to look at, might have a higher percentage, but Ashtabula County, based on 2% of the homes that sold during the period of time that they were looking at, since the last six-year reappraisal, 32% increase. And that can vary from district to district. In Geneva, it was a little over 25%. In other districts, I think it might have been as high as 40%. With all of Ashtabula County schools on that 20 mil floor, that results in the taking a district below the 20 mil floor, and then they have to bring that back up to the 20 mil floor, results in an unvoted tax increase. That's the way the law works. Districts have no control over that.
Now, I gotta ask you a question here, because I'm confused. Anybody else out there confused? All right. Now, Mr. Lilly, we have greater wealth on paper with property values, yes?
Yes,
So that means we have greater capacity, yes?
that's correct.
And if we have greater capacity, then we're probably gonna receive less state aid?
That is correct.
No!
Based on
That's
study,
not
yes.
fair!
Well, however, it is a average, a 3-year average.
Okay.
So a district doesn't take the full hit in the first year, but basically what they're looking at in this year's funding is what, tax year 23, 22, and 21. So 23 is the high year, and that's averaged out. But say in the case of the Geneva School District, well, that one-time property appraisal amount may result in about $1 million that of new funding via property tax. In the first year, they're going to receive $500,000 less on their base cost funding. In the next funding year, if this continues, they're going to receive even a higher amount, because that average is going to increase as $389 million goes off, and 502, whatever it increases into the next year, tax year 24, goes on. And so each year they will receive more And they'll see that every year now because of that higher tax valuation.
Okay, now, I think I've got a sneaky way to figure this out to make it fair. So if our valuation goes up, and it did, and our capacity goes up, then what if the base cost rose and the state had to pay more on the base cost than the categoricals? That would kind of even it out, wouldn't it?
It could in certain situations.
And who's responsible for that budget? State. We're coming to something. Let that percolate in your mind. Anything else on this slide? Anything that folks don't understand? This 2004 that's mandated by the state? It's also tied in. It's not as easy as overturning HB 920. It's also it's a constitutional amendment that we voted on. And keep in mind what property values and interest rates were like in the 70s. Those of you who were buying houses then, remember mortgages 15%, car loans 18%. It was crazy. And so it made sense to kind of put a cap on this runaway inflation. Does it make sense today? You're going to hear that debate in the Ohio legislature this spring.
Those reduction factors can work both ways, as I said before, whether it increases or decreases. And there are things that can cause it to decrease. For instance, when they phased out annual personal property tax, people saw our school districts or taxing entities saw a reduction in their valuation. Other things can happen in a district, like that district Manchester local, when those power plants went out. That takes property valuation off of their tax due. And you can go off the 20 mil floor and back on the 20 mil floor. Geneva was on it when I started, went off in 2010 because of various decreases, and then was back on in 2020. So it's been on the 20 mil floor since 2020.
Good with this slide? You can ask questions then later. Next slide, please. All right. So now we're talking about inputs. So if we don't, and notice, these were the districts on the guarantee, and really, the Fair School Funding Plan started to have an impact in this year. If we don't update, we don't do the phase in. Now, the governor has said he would continue 5 and 6, that's his plan. But if you don't update, and let me back up. We determine the base cost by taking the average teacher salary across the state, throughout the highlands, throughout the lowlands, including their benefits, superintendent's wages, treasurer's wages, all of that based on an average. And that average is going to go up. So it costs more in 23 to fund a school, the base cost, than it would in 20. So in order to keep that rising carefully, you have to raise the base cost, which means the state is going to have to come up with more money. Makes sense. I think that's the end of our slides, is it not?
Nope, that is the end of your slide.
So how many of you are confused now? It's okay, it's complex. And this, we kept it kind of simple for you, believe it or not. But now, you're inquisitive people, we are open to any and all questions. This is your turn before I give you your homework assignment.
Before I ask my question, I'd like to finish my comments about the ESC.
Oh, please do.
We also serve Happy Hearts School and Building Bridges, very important components of what we do. And the question I have is, now that the governor is on the cover of 5 and 6, do you think what's going to be needed to do to continue that coverage, 7, 8?
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, it's going to be a challenge. You would think that it should be something easy because this is the first time the state has had an actual funding formula for schools based on data, based on what it costs to educate a student at the particular time, and actual costs, as Dr. Patterson said, the actual costs of how much it costs for a teacher, how much it costs for superintendent, treasurer, operations, school resource officer, whatever, everything is based on actual costs. It's not fully funded yet. It needs to go in those next few years to be fully funded, but you have a gentleman who was the state Senate president from the Lima area, Matt Huffman, who is now the Speaker of the House and controls things in the House, where the budget now goes after the governor puts his budget out. And he is a big proponent for private parochial schools, school choice, taking a lot of money from schools via vouchers. He's got his own, he's already saying that the fair school funding plan is not sustainable. Now, the state right now is flush with cash. Money has been taken from the pot and directed to state money to private parochial schools, which kind of goes back to Dr. Patterson pointing out the state constitution that there should be one funding of schools that's adequate or thorough and efficient. And now we have created by the legislature charter schools, public charter schools that took money with not a whole lot of accountability. And now vouchers take money out and go to private parochial schools with not the same accountability that public schools have. So the challenge is going to be in the legislature, getting the approval to phase this in fully and get the inputs updated, because if the inputs aren't updated, it puts more burden back on the local schools and takes less burden from the state, because you're not raising those costs that school districts are saving.
I can talk about it.
I don't think you can.
It's being recorded,
It's being
Jack.
recorded from your.
So how did that get away from the state to allow local schools and all of that? Because I'm an alumni of St. John's, and I think it stinks, okay? You know, they've got plenty of money. How did you let it, how did it just, get out of control?
Goes back to the Voinovich administration. You think back to the Cleveland schools who were struggling in the 90s. It was, vouchers were supposed to be an experiment to allow children, I mean, we believe in choice, yes. That a child, a parent would know best. His child should be homeschooled, and the parochial school was best. So the intentions were good in terms of that one experiment. It was supposed to be an experiment. No longer an experiment in the momentum game. And especially in the last budget, and we're looking at this budget, the income for eligibility for vouchers was increased, which allowed more students to be eligible, and it's created, because there's only so much money to go around. And there is a Supreme Court case in the making to determine whether vouchers are constitutional. Now, you heard the Constitution. So I'll leave that up to you, what you think is right. Other questions? Hey.
So I know there are some variables that can apply to increases in property.
Hold on, Louis, wait for the mic.
I thought I was talking about.
No, it's being recorded, that's all.
Okay, I see. So I know there's a couple variables that can play a part to justifying increases in property taxes. But hypothetically, could a monumental increase, like we've recently experienced, be polarized to an extent and that would strategically reduce the amount of education funding?
So are you asking that, if I'm hearing the question right, for certain a certain agenda beyond a pure approach to school funding, with property valuations being manipulated? Is that what you're asking?
I would, yes. If that is a hypothetical possibility.
Hypothetically, it could be done, but I would hope that the local taxpayers would raise holy pain to make sure that the property valuations were absolutely as they should be and not being manipulated. We have somebody from the auditor's office. John Mead, do you want to comment on that?
It would be difficult to manipulate it, but anything is possible, as Murphy said. But the auditor's office is quite astute when it comes to the evaluation process and all of the state regulations, et cetera.
Spoken by one who worked with the county auditor's office. But theoretically, yes, so I'll give that up to you again. Another question. Hey, how you doing? All the way from Austinburg, right?
Just to beat a dead horse. The last tax increase we got, for me, was very huge, almost 50%. The auditor's office told me that was done by the state. Any truth to that?
Well, the state, and Mr. Mead could probably speak to that too, but the state does instruct counties during that reappraisal and trying to update what they think the average should be for the entire county. And the county auditor is taking a look at each taxing district and determining what each of those taxing districts might be. But trying to come up then with all those individual taxing districts to beat that average or be as close as possible. Now, there's also something with the reappraisal process. If districts, if it didn't have anything to do with the 20 mil floor and having to bring that back up to the 20 mils, in any reappraisal or triennial update, there's that average. If a individual taxpayer is at that same average on their valuation increase, they would probably see no tax increase unless there were additional levies passed in that taxing district. If a individual taxpayer was above that, they would see a higher increase than the average, and if they were below that, they would see a lower increase than the average. So there are things at play in there already, but this particular one had to do with the large property value increases and all the districts in Ashtabula County being on the 20 mil floor.
So Mike, to answer your question from a former legislator standpoint, it took me 8 years and then some for the Fair School Funding Plan. What I really wanted to get at was how do we attract and retain quality teachers? You can't do that unless it's funded first. And then the other thing I wanted to get at was this 920 constitutional amendment that puts a cap. It would only make sense that we could cap it so it was only a slight increase a year, but something to keep pace with inflation, so school districts wouldn't have to come back to you all the time with levies. But you're right, that's something that's going to have to take place at the state level, and that's going to be a dogfight to figure that one out. Yes. Other questions? Here's one from Ashtabula, Ward 4.
For some of these schools that have, like the parochial schools that have tuition that's paid, is there any consideration taking off of this number, like the $5,079 from the individual payments? So if you paid $10,000 for your tuition, is that money been taken into account in your projection? Do they get that deducted from what the state gives them, or is that on top of the tuition?
You want to take this one? Or you want to? Go ahead.
Well, I believe in the law for vouchers that the parochial private school has to take that amount. You can't charge them the difference between the tuition that they would pay and that voucher amount. I believe that they have to take the voucher amount. Is that correct?
Yes. So remember what the base cost is now, 8,000 and some? That goes right to the parochial school. Because the money follows the student. So if the tuition is 10,000, When it's 8,000, they only have to make up the 2,000 difference.
One thing that the Fair School Funding Plan did was direct funding. In the past, prior to the Fair School Funding Plan, districts were funded according to all the resident students that resided in that district. And then money was taken from that district and sent to a charter school, parochial school, or open enrollment. So some districts could see a very large deduction, which didn't make treasurers happy, probably didn't make superintendents happy either. But now the money flows directly from the state to those schools, and it no longer flows through the local educated district.
So the problem with the vouchers, is that taking money directly from this, the public schools? I saw a bunch of congressmen speaking sometime last fall, I don't know what was online. And they were saying, oh, no, there's two separate funds for the public schools and for the vouchers. And so it's not that the vouchers are taking the money from the public schools. Is that correct?
Yes and no. There is one pot, remember the general revenue fund. And that does have a limit. So funding for the public schools come out of the general revenue fund. Funding for vouchers and parochial schools is also coming out of the same fund. So as you take more out of the fund to go where, anywhere else with public schools, it reduces the amount of funding. Depends how you look at it. Question, go ahead. Two minutes.
My question is probably a little along the same lines, because I know when we had Mr. Ludley speak to the league, he discussed that there's a challenge when students move, when the money has to follow the student and they go to other districts, et cetera. So, you have a bunch, you have 10 students from Geneva that go to Ashtabula, so that money has to go there. So then that money's not available for Geneva. But then I've had questions where people say, well, why shouldn't the money follow the student because they're no longer there? And I understand that part, but I'm still thinking, well, at Geneva, they still have, all these other teachers, they still have some other costs. So am I missing something here, or?
Well, open enrollment has been around for a long time, much longer than charter schools and vouchers. And I don't think anybody's arguing this, because Dr. Patterson said the ability for somebody to decide, okay, I'd rather have my student instructed in this district than my resident district, if it works for them. So yes, it was taken from that district to another district, but it was still a traditional public school. Now what the legislature created was first charter schools, and even like the vouchers and the charter schools, it started as an experiment. It's supposed to be a 5-year experiment for charter schools, and somewhere I think in the second year, they just opened it up to everything with no accountability. Now, the problem there was, yes, the money came to us, but they didn't only take the state funding, they took state and local, because at the time, the 1 year, we were getting $6,020 for a student. That was the amount set per student, but that didn't mean that we were getting $6,020, because we had our local share that's deducted from that. So our local share might have been $2,000, and we got $4,020 from the state. So they not only took the state funding, but they took the locally voted tax money from the district. Now, that's kind of been with the Fair School Funding Plan, it's direct funding. But as Dr. Patterson said, it all comes from the same pot. So if you increase the number of charter schools and students going there funded, or increase the number of vouchers, which they did with universal vouchers, which took cases where a parochial student, the whole thing was to give choice. Well, people made choice a long time ago, say years ago, their kindergarten, and now they're a senior. They sent them to a parochial school. Now this year, they can be funded by state funding. You know, they never set foot in a public school district. It wasn't a matter of they weren't happy with the education in that particular district and they wanted to go here. They were always there. So this took people, the majority, I forget what the percentage is, but it's over 80% of this new voucher funding is funding students that never set foot in a public school. They've always been in a private or parochial school. It's just now it's diverted state funds to that. And
Because they
taken away.
raised the eligibility to allow more students to come based on their family income, sort of thing. Go ahead, then we'll get to you guys.
So I'm a related service provider for special needs students.
Yes.
My question pertains specifically to the categorical aid and what is included in the special needs funding, simply because the bill is being proposed in Oklahoma, deeming related services, questioning medical necessity, and moving it towards a more medical model for therapies and related services. So what funding is within the special needs to cover, to guarantee that students still have, the school districts have access to hire these professionals despite the proposed stuff?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, it does. So special needs was in a state of flux when we proposed the fair school funding plan. So that was another one of the studies that has come back. We know what those costs are, done by experts, and it's a boatload of money. And you're familiar with this, the rest of you can tune out. So you know how they're different categories and that. We're looking to reconfigure that so it's more fair because there are more students with disabilities now than there were even 5 years ago. And so we have to tailor make it to meet the needs of those kids. Studies are there. It's going to cost a lot more money. They're proposing that they adopt the studies, but remember that's in addition to the phase-in, addition to the base cost. We'll have to see where that goes. But we are sensitive to that. And we had a special committee just on those children. Jenny Logan, who was it? Yeah, it was Jenny. She did an excellent job. Yeah, poverty and such. So yes, we're aware of that. Gus?
Back to the $20 if you mind. There was talk about including the emergency levies and calculated with the $20 million for. You know about that?
I haven't heard that. I mean, emergency levies right now are not included in that 20 mil floor.
Right.
Only the current operating levies.
Well, it was proposed last 35th. I think it's going to come up again. But if it does, what would that do to?
Well, it's difficult. I don't know how they would do that because emergency levies are different than your current operating levies. Current operating levies are set the village, and then it's going to raise this, certified by the county auditor to raise this amount of money in that first year, and then that money is what causes the reduction factors to reduce the village. The emergency levy is a set dollar amount. And that's why things like emergency levies, and then if an emergency levy becomes a substitute levy, they're not included in there because they're a set dollar amount. That it's only going to raise that amount each year already. So I don't know how they'd ever change it. Now, what has been discussed at the legislature is lowering the 20.4. Looking at taking that down. So the districts are no longer guaranteed a minimum of 20, but say a minimum of 18 or 17 or 15.
It's still, the talk's still going on. I'll let you know. It's probably about it.
Liz has a question.
Thank you.
My question is, how does the funding affect failing school districts?
How does the money affect what?
Failing school districts.
Failing school districts. Oh my goodness, I was there when Youngstown was taken over, Lorraine was taken over, I voted against that. Because there are a number of reasons why districts fail. And let's look at that, and then I want to talk about the funding, fair enough? So, with open enrollment, students can leave certain districts. True? And sometimes those with the least amount of means are caught in districts. And you have potentially a large number of students who are economically disadvantaged, caught in districts. But the state demands that we test all students. Now think what happens when those kids who choose to leave do, and what happens to the test scores of those who remain in those particular districts. Oh, they're failing school. Don't follow the school, don't follow the teachers, don't follow the parents. That is why the economically disadvantaged piece is so critically important to be implemented. I don't think there's a failing school. There's a failed funding for schools to provide those services necessary to make an equitable education for those students. Does that make sense? So when we get this phased in, and that's our homework assignment, those students will get more money. And think about the economically disadvantaged, the things that they may not have. Books at home. Both parents may be working. They may need more after-school help. They may need more pull-out time within the school to help with those certain skills that they may have been able to lack. Don't follow their own. Are we to condemn students for years to come because we didn't provide an equitable opportunity for them out of the gate? I don't want that on my conscience. They're all our kids. It takes a village. It takes a county, it takes a state. Sorry, I got a little excited out there. But you're right. We've got to fund it. And that would account for that.
It's not fair that we're paying for their choice. I mean, they are entitled to a choice. I mean, how are you balancing the amount of support you give? And why are they also held to the same standards? Because I've heard that they don't want to be held to the same testing requirements that the public schools are held to.
That's correct. And do they offer the same services all across the board? And do they accept all the students of public schools? That's a challenge. And you're right. And this is a conundrum. We believe in choice. True? But hey, Jack Howe, you went to St. John, right? That was a choice you made. Who paid for your education?
Who paid for what?
Your education at St. John.
Very low at that time.
Your parents did?
Yeah,
You made sacrifices?
it was so low, I don't know.
I guess my point is that maybe we have forgotten that with certain choices come certain responsibilities. And if you read the Constitution, and you did, it's fairly clear. Now, Constitution is only good if it's followed and if it's enforced. That's why there is a lawsuit coming up this summer to determine the constitutionality of vouchers. That wasn't a political statement, that's a factual one. Fair enough? You good on that? Does that answer your question? And
Does the state limit, what's the limit on the amount of vouchers?
it's the same amount that we would offer, again, the 8,020. The question was, is there a limit? Go ahead.
Go ahead, you were doing it, you're like that, you got this.
Okay.
Is there a limit?
Is there a limit? Yes, there is, in terms of the base cost for the student, to get that 8,000.
The numbers of vouchers.
Oh! No. No.
Worth $1 million this year.
The $1 billion. $1 billion, no.
Do you want to roll forward to the homework? Because I know I had put it
Yeah,
online
I'm
around
sorry.
7:30. No, that's fine,
I'm
that's fine.
sorry. Any other questions? All right. So let's get into this. Thank
And they
you.
also have some home, like, what you're gonna give them as homework, or they can find some informative things in there to get them.
You mean like tomorrow night, there is a online League of Windows statewide event taking place?
Yes, and the registration is in there, and the QR code is there. If you just want to scan it and register, it's all online.
Fantastic. I'll be joining you for that for a short period of time. Well, Lisa? I'm coming then, Jess. I'll give them their homework assignment.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. And I apologize for being late. My question, I'm wondering, is about accountability. And I'm not sure if you've already addressed it before I came in. But a point where we disagree is, I do feel as though there are schools and districts who fail students, for whatever reason. So my wondering is, if there is a base that all schools and districts will get to support their students' learning, what is accountability if you're not seeing improvements, if you're not seeing change, if you're not seeing increase in scores over years? What happens then?
Well, the Kasich administration had a state takeover, which wasn't good. It didn't change anything. If I were still in the legislature, that's another thing I'd be working on to determine where we go. And the thing of it is, and you've kind of guessed this by now, it is very complex. I couldn't do everything in the legislature that I wanted to do. But if we work together in a bipartisan fashion, things like that, we have to address accountability. We have to address the teacher shortage. We have to address these sorts of issues that we all face, and to stick our heads in the sand or to go in a corner and not do anything is wrong as well. Jessica?
Our follow-up. We have to change the metrics in which we're evaluating somebody is succeeding or failing. I think that equity calls for that. And
Yeah.
so it's, yes, there's money, yes, there needs to be accountability, but the measures that we use are not measuring learning. And so if we can make those more equitable, then we're getting something.
Peggy Langer was working on that before she was turned out. And a lot of good people, the problem with term limits is that a lot of good people get swept out. And things fall by the wayside. It took me 8 years to really develop relationships and trust that we need to get things passed. And 8 years goes by in a hurry. Any closing questions?
Thank you.
All right, so here's the deal. Why do we educate people? You're all educated. You mentioned that you went to school some way, shape, or form. What's the purpose of education? Ever think about it?
They ultimately get out the citizens.
Okay, good citizens, and an educated democracy?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We need good citizens. We need people to read the paper. Right, Sarvika? We need people to read the paper and buy the paper. I'm biased plug there. We need people to be informed. My goodness gracious, as a former history teacher and Model UN advisor, we wanted our students to be so engaged that they would actually argue in the classroom over issues. That's healthy. A good spirited debate. We need to do that. That's one purpose. A second purpose. Job preparedness, correct? Think how many positions require an education. A truck driver. Heck, I'm the only person in the state legislature who operated the lift bridge in the Ashtabula Harbor, fun fact. I did. It took a while to learn how to do do that. Now, that job had a lot of ups and downs, but, according to, but I did. It's all about education. They have to be willing to learn to fulfill the ranks when those of us who retire move on. We have to have an educated workforce. So you're right. For democracy, for workforce, there's something even more needs. Yes. Now, what's Patterson thinking of this time? I know what you think. What? The ultimate purpose of education. Money? Let me tell you a joke about money. The two wealthiest guys in town were standing over the grave of the one who just died, even wealthier today. You know what one man said to the other? Question? How much did he leave behind? All of it. Is it about money? Kind of shallow if you ask me. Money can't buy you love. I've read that before.
Is it about freedom?
It's about freedom. But it's more.
Self-fulfillment.
Pardon me?
Self-fulfillment.
You don't say. Let me ask an expert here. What did you do? She thought she was off the phone. What was your gig when you were growing up from age to another? What was your gig?
What was my gig?
What'd you do?
I taught music.
You taught music. You don't say. And what school did you teach music?
City school.
City schools. So you did not live at the city school, did you?
No.
You lived at home.
Yes.
So when you bid your significant others goodbye, where did you say you were going in the morning?
Or she's school.
What word did she use first? What did you do? Teach. To school. To school. Does it work for you to teach music?
Well, it was work.
I think it was a passion.
Yes.
And I think you loved it. You're still doing it too, right?
No.
You're still teaching.
I'm still.
Thank you. You are born with certain gifts. And it's the public school that exposes people to different options. And let me give you an example. There was this thing called home ec. Remember that one time a long ago? And who could only take home ec in the old days? Girls. All right. Fall 1973, Iowa High School senior Larry Braga, some of you know Larry Braga, came down to my first period study hall. Boys, he said, I want to start a new class, boys home ec. How many are interested? Now, you have to understand, in the old Jefferson High School, the court was available for seniors. We're cool. We're going to the court, basking in the sun. First period, we're going to be cool. How many hands do you think went up? 0. We weren't going to cook, and please do not tell my wife this. We weren't going to cook because who was going to do that for us someday? This is in the 1970s, keep in mind, I've grown up. Then he said the magical words. You get to eat whatever you cook. First period, remember? How many hands went up? They all did. He had an experimental class of boys in home ec. Now, I discovered quickly in that class that cooking is not one of my talents. In fact, Nancy left me home with the boys once with macaroni out of a box. We played too long, the boys got hungry. So I said, using my mathematical skills, that if I doubled the heat, I could have the time. Now, makes sense, does it not, gentlemen? Gentlemen, work with me here. 576-6300, Carlucci Pizza. Not my gift. I discovered that. I don't like cooking. I don't like cleaning typing, I'll do all the lots of hands. I know it. In the first semester, Mr. Braga comes back. Boys, I want you to take personal typing. Now, this is spring. Senior year. Days before graduation. Personal typing. How many of us raised their hand? What was that number you used, Cam? 0. 0. Then he said those magical words. I looked at the roster of this first period class. Some of the cutest girls are in that room. How many hands went up? All did. I took personal typing for 6 months. I still type every day now, and not the poke and hope. Because of that class. I never would have had that opportunity had we not offered that class. And what else do we not offer kids that they might be aware of unless we have the cornucopia of them to determine what their gifts are and what their vocation might be. And I can tell you, if your gifts match your vocation, you will never ever work a day in your life, and you'll be more productive, and you'll feel better about yourself, and you'll be better for your community. Isn't that what we want, my brothers and sisters? Come on, come on. That's what we're looking at education. So here is your assignment. You must get in touch with your state legislature, which is David Thomas and Sarah Fowler Arthur and Senator O'Brien, and call them and email them and anybody else that you have on the list there, and tell them to do the right thing. It's a moral imperative that we get this right for you, for Ohio, for everybody's future. Do not be shy. Do not back down. This is your moment. This is our time. It's about the future, but the future begins tonight. God bless you.
Can I? I'm just gonna make a quick plug. You guys have the handouts? The handouts are up there. If you scan, that's gonna take you so you can get right in contact with your state legislature. Some may have that number on speed dial. I hope you do. Also available, the League of Women Voters. This event will be posted. It was on our YouTube page. And I believe on the other one, there was the QR code to get involved in tomorrow night's event with your very own John Patterson, who will be speaking probably more along the lines of vouchers tomorrow night.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And thank you. Thank you for attending this evening.